32 years after Robert Harmon vanished, his name still sat quietly inside a federal database, tagged with a single unresolved label, presumed defection. It was a conclusion reached quickly in 1987 and rarely questioned afterward. At the height of the Cold War, defections were an easy answer, politically convenient, strategically comforting, and administratively efficient. When an intelligence analyst disappeared, the system preferred betrayal over failure. By 2019, Robert Harmon's case was considered functionally closed. That was when Catherine Mills noticed it. Catherine had spent most of her career doing work few agents wanted. She was not a field operative. She did not conduct arrests or interrogations. Instead, she specialized in reviewing dormant intelligence files, cases that had stalled, disappeared from active rotation, or been quietly forgotten. Her job was to look for anomalies. And Robert Harmon's file was anomalous. For a disappearance involving a CIA-affiliated analyst, the file was unnaturally thin. There were no competing theories documented, no unresolved evidence logs, and no long-term follow-up memos. It was as if the case had been sealed prematurely, frozen in time by its earliest assumption. Catherine noticed something else that unsettled her. The case index referenced several subdocuments that were never summarized in the main narrative. One of those references, Exhibit F-17, appeared only once, buried deep in an appendix. There was no description attached. Curious, Catherine requested the original document through archival services. The request took longer than usual. When the file finally arrived, it came with an outdated classification stamp and a yellowed cover sheet that suggested it had not been accessed in decades. The report inside was dated October 14, 1987, 3 days after Robert Harmon disappeared. It had been written by a junior FBI field agent whose name no longer appeared in any active directories. The subject line was brief, almost dismissive. Statement from highway maintenance employee. Catherine read it twice, then she read it again. According to the report, a Virginia Department of Transportation worker named Leon Bradshaw had been conducting routine shoulder maintenance near Interstate 95 on the morning of October 11. 1987, the same morning Robert Harmon failed to arrive at work. Leon reported observing a dark-colored utility van parked several hundred feet ahead of where Harmon's abandoned vehicle would later be discovered. The van was not marked. There were no emergency lights, no insignia. Leon stated that 3 individuals were present. 2 men were standing outside the van, engaged in what appeared to be a tense discussion. A 3rd individual was seated inside the vehicle. That individual, Leon noted, appeared distressed. The report stated that Leon briefly made eye contact with the man inside the van. The man's hands were visible. His posture suggested restraint, not relaxation. There was no indication that the individual was free to leave. Moments later, the van pulled back onto the highway and disappeared into traffic. Leon continued his shift. He did not know that a missing person investigation would soon dominate national intelligence discussions. What troubled Catherine most was not the content of the report, it was what followed. There was no indication of a follow-up interview, no attempt to identify the van, no effort to locate similar vehicles operating in the area that morning. At the bottom of the document, a single notation had been added in pen, not relevant to defection hypothesis. Catherine leaned back in her chair. For more than 3 decades, the FBI had been operating under a foundational assumption that Robert Harmon had willingly vanished. And because of that assumption, a witness who described a possible abduction had been ignored. Not overlooked, ignored. As Catherine closed the file, she realized something deeply unsettling. If this report had been taken seriously in 1987, Robert Harmon's fate might have been uncovered within days. Instead, the truth had been buried, and the system had never looked back. When Catherine Mills finished reading Leon Bradshaw's statement, one question refused to leave her mind. Why had no one gone back? Leon had not been anonymous. He had not been vague. He had not been unreliable. He was a state employee, on duty, at a precise location, at a documented time. His report had been filed within days of Robert Harmon's disappearance. It contained observable behavior, a vehicle description, and a potential victim in distress. By any investigative standard, It should have triggered immediate follow-up. Instead, it had been quietly sidelined. Catherine requested permission to locate Leon Bradshaw. The approval came slowly and without enthusiasm. Robert Harmon's case, after all, was still officially categorized as a Cold War defection. Reopening old witness testimony risked reopening uncomfortable questions about past decisions, ignored evidence, and institutional failure. Leon was living in a small town outside Richmond when Catherine finally reached him in early 2019. He was 72 years old. When she introduced herself and mentioned Robert Harmon's name, there was a pause on the line. "I always wondered when someone would call," Leon said. During their in-person interview, Leon's memory proved sharper than Catherine expected. He did not need prompting. He did not need reminders. The events of that morning had stayed with him for more than 30 years. He remembered the weather. He remembered the sound of traffic. And he remembered the man inside the van. Leon described the vehicle again, dark, boxy, unmarked, with tinted side windows. It was parked at an odd angle, not like a vehicle experiencing mechanical trouble. The two men standing outside appeared alert, scanning their surroundings. Their posture, Leon said, was not casual. When Catherine asked about the third man, Leon's voice lowered. "He didn't look like someone going somewhere by choice," Leon said. "He looked like someone hoping someone would notice." Leon said the man inside the van appeared to be trying to catch his eye. There was no visible struggle, but there was tension, the kind that doesn't need violence to be obvious. Catherine asked Leon why he hadn't pushed harder at the time. Leon's answer was simple. "I gave my statement. I assumed they'd handle it." They hadn't. Catherine returned to the original FBI file and began reconstructing the days following Robert Harmon's disappearance. The pattern that emerged was disturbing in its consistency. Every piece of information that supported defection had been elevated. Every piece that challenged it had been minimized. Within 48 hours of Harmon being reported missing, internal communications between federal agencies had already framed the narrative. An intelligence analyst with access to sensitive material had likely defected. Once that narrative took hold, contradictory evidence became inconvenient. Leon Bradshaw's report was not dismissed because it lacked credibility. It was dismissed because it did not fit. Catherine documented this shift in her internal review memo. She noted that the defection hypothesis had never been tested against alternative explanations. No parallel investigation into abduction or foul play had ever been formally opened. The case had been solved before it was investigated. As Catherine expanded her review, she identified another troubling omission. Robert Harmon's final movements had been reconstructed almost entirely through assumption. His abandoned car had been examined, his home had been searched, his finances had been scrutinized. But his professional activities, the very reason defection was suspected, had never been fully audited. Catherine requested Robert Harmon's final assignment logs. They revealed that in the weeks before his disappearance, Robert had been reassigned from routine analytical duties to a compliance review involving a defense contractor. The reassignment was temporary, quiet, and undocumented in public summaries. The contractor's name appeared repeatedly in classified appendices, Titan Aerospace. At first glance, Titan Aerospace looked unremarkable. They were one of dozens of firms supplying components to the Department of Defense. Their contracts were substantial, but not unusual for the era. What caught Catherine's attention was timing. Robert Harmon's reassignment to the Titan Review occurred just 3 weeks before he disappeared. The review itself focused on cost overruns and unexplained budget reallocations tied to a satellite guidance project. According to internal notes, Robert had flagged inconsistencies significant enough to warrant escalation. He had not completed the review. Catherine cross-referenced internal communications from the same period. Several emails and memos referencing Titan Aerospace had been partially redacted. Others were missing entirely. Requests for clarification had gone unanswered. Then Catherine found a short, handwritten note attached to one internal document. "Escalation unnecessary, handle quietly." There was no signature. But there was a routing stamp. It passed through the office of Titan Aerospace's senior security liaison, a man named Victor Castellano. Catherine began assembling a timeline. Robert Harmon raised concerns. Titan Aerospace pushed back. Internal pressure increased. Robert disappeared. And at the same time, an unmarked van was reported near his abandoned car. The implications were no longer abstract. If Robert Harmon had uncovered information that threatened a powerful defense contract, defection would have been the perfect cover. It explained his absence without requiring accountability. It closed the case without exposing internal conflict. And it justified ignoring a witness who suggested something far more dangerous. By the time Catherine presented her interim findings to a small internal review group, the tone of the discussion had shifted. This was no longer about whether the FBI had misinterpreted a disappearance. It was about whether they had unknowingly protected a crime. As the meeting concluded, Catherine added one final note to her file. If Robert Harmon had been abducted, someone had planned it. And if it had been planned, someone had been paid. Once Catherine Mills shifted her focus toward Titan Aerospace, the case began to reveal a second disappearance, not of a man, but of accountability. Titan Aerospace had spent decades cultivating a reputation as a dependable, patriotic defense contractor. Their marketing emphasized national security, innovation, and loyalty. Internally, however, the culture was far more rigid. Whistleblowing was not tolerated. Delays were unacceptable. Problems were to be contained, not exposed. Robert Harmon's compliance review threatened that structure. The satellite guidance project he had been assigned to audit was already behind schedule and significantly over budget. Internal Titan documents, later recovered, showed cost overruns that could not be explained by material shortages or design changes. Funds appeared to be redirected through subcontractors with vague scopes of work and minimal oversight. Robert had flagged those discrepancies. According to a former colleague who later spoke under condition of anonymity, Robert had expressed concern that the financial irregularities were not accidental. He believed someone was deliberately inflating costs and disguising them as technical expenses. That belief put him on a collision course with Titan's security division. Victor Castellano was not a public-facing executive. His name rarely appeared in press releases or shareholder briefings, but inside Titan Aerospace, he held enormous influence. As senior security liaison, Castellano's role extended far beyond physical protection. He managed internal risk, legal, informational, and reputational. Castellano's background was not in engineering, it was in private security. Before joining Titan, he had spent years consulting for firms that specialized in asset protection, crisis containment, and when necessary, quiet removals. His contacts spanned multiple industries, including logistics, waste management, and off-the-books transportation services. When Catherine began mapping Castellano's professional network, she noticed a recurring pattern. Whenever Titan Aerospace faced a potential internal problem, a lawsuit, a whistleblower, or a regulatory audit, the same small group of subcontractors appeared nearby. They did not resolve technical issues. They handled people. One of those subcontractors was listed as a regional logistics firm with a deliberately generic name. Its stated business purpose was specialized transport and disposal. Its operations manager in 1987 was Dennis Yule. Catherine requested background information on the firm. The public records were sparse. The company had changed names twice. Its ownership structure was intentionally opaque. Several of its contracts were classified or routed through intermediaries. But one detail stood out. In the late 1980s, the firm had access to unmarked utility vans. Catherine cross-referenced vehicle procurement records from the period. Several unmarked vans had been leased through shell companies tied indirectly to Titan Aerospace. The leases were short-term, expiring just weeks after Robert Harmon's disappearance. No explanation was provided for their use. Catherine presented this information to her internal review board. The reaction was cautious, but the implications were impossible to ignore. If Titan Aerospace had perceived Robert Harmon as a threat, not to national security, but to corporate stability, they had both the motive and the means to neutralize him. The defection narrative suddenly looked less like a conclusion and more like a shield. As Catherine continued digging, she uncovered evidence that internal communications between Titan Aerospace and certain defense officials had spiked in the days following Robert's disappearance. Meeting logs referenced containment strategy and narrative alignment. None of those communications mentioned Robert by name. They didn't need to. By removing Robert Harmon from the equation, Titan Aerospace avoided scrutiny. The satellite guidance project continued. Cost overruns were absorbed into future budgets. No audit findings were publicly released, and a man vanished without leaving a trace. Catherine began to understand why the Van report had been ignored. Acknowledging it would have required acknowledging the possibility of corporate violence, an idea far more destabilizing than defection. It would have raised questions about contractor oversight, federal complicity, and the quiet power of private security networks operating alongside government institutions. The system chose the simpler story. As part of her investigation, Catherine requested interviews with several former Titan employees. Most declined. A few agreed, but offered little beyond rehearsed talking points. They insisted Robert Harmon had no significant conflicts, and that his disappearance was unfortunate but unrelated to Titan's operations. One former mid-level manager, however, said something that stayed with Catherine. "People like Robert don't disappear by accident," he said. "They disappear when someone decides they're inconvenient." Catherine documented the statement. Then she reviewed Dennis Yule's employment history. Dennis had joined the logistics firm in the early 1980s after serving in the military. His record was clean, no arrests, no complaints. He was described by colleagues as reliable and quiet, someone who followed instructions without asking questions. In 1987, Dennis had been promoted to operations manager. That promotion placed him in charge of coordinating transport logistics for sensitive assignments that were never fully documented. Catherine cross-checked Dennis Yule's known work locations against Robert Harmon's disappearance timeline. They overlapped multiple times. The evidence was circumstantial, but the pattern was undeniable. Robert Harmon's disappearance sat at the intersection of corporate risk management, private security operations, and a federal narrative that discouraged scrutiny. Catherine prepared a confidential briefing summarizing her findings. Her conclusion was carefully worded but unmistakable. Robert Harmon had not defected. He had not vanished voluntarily. He had been removed, and the removal had been facilitated by a corporate structure designed to make such actions invisible. As she finalized the briefing, Catherine received an update from a federal liaison. Dennis Yule had made contact with authorities. He was terminally ill, and he wanted to talk. Dennis Yule had spent most of his life avoiding attention. He was not a strategist. He was not a decision-maker. He was a man who executed plans designed by others. By the time federal authorities received word that Dennis wanted to talk, he was 68 years old and dying of pancreatic cancer. The prognosis was measured in weeks, not months. According to his physician, Dennis had become increasingly anxious in the final days of his life, not about death itself, but about something unresolved, something unfinished. Catherine Mills was notified quietly. No formal reopening of the case was announced. No press briefings were scheduled. What followed was treated as a sensitive internal development, the kind that required caution rather than celebration. Dennis agreed to meet at a hospice facility outside Baltimore. When Catherine arrived, she found a man who looked far older than his age. His hands trembled, his breathing was labored, but his eyes were alert and burdened. He did not ask for legal representation. He did not ask for immunity. Instead, he asked a single question. Did they ever find him? Catherine did not answer immediately. She asked Dennis why he had reached out now. Dennis closed his eyes before speaking. "I don't want this to die with me," he said. Over the next several hours, Dennis described a version of events that aligned with what Catherine had already begun to suspect, but hearing it spoken aloud transformed suspicion into certainty. In October of 1987, Dennis had been working as operations manager for a private logistics firm contracted through intermediaries connected to Titan Aerospace. The firm specialized in discrete transport assignments, jobs that required speed, anonymity, and silence. Dennis did not ask why. He was paid to coordinate. On the morning of Robert Harmon's disappearance, Dennis received instructions to oversee a pickup. The details were minimal. Location coordinates were provided. The subject was described as non-compliant but non-violent. Dennis was told the matter was urgent. A van was assigned. 2 contractors handled the physical work. Dennis followed in a separate vehicle. When Catherine asked if Dennis knew who Robert Harmon was at the time, he shook his head. "No," he said. "I knew he was a problem." "That's all," Dennis described the moment he realized the situation was irreversible. The man they picked up was frightened. He pleaded. He asked to go home. Dennis said he told himself it was none of his business. Afterward, the instructions changed. What began as transport became disposal. Dennis did not describe the final act in detail. He did not need to. The implication was clear, and Catherine did not push for specifics. This was not about reenacting violence. It was about understanding how a system had allowed it to happen. When Catherine asked why Dennis had stayed silent for so long, his answer reflected a familiar logic. "Everyone else did," he said. Dennis explained that following the incident, there were no further questions. Payments were processed. Contracts ended. The van leases expired. The logistics firm changed its name. And the defection narrative took hold. For decades, Dennis watched as Robert Harmon's disappearance was discussed publicly as an act of betrayal. He watched as the man was vilified without ever being found. He watched the story harden into accepted history. "I told myself it didn't matter anymore," Dennis said. But it did. Dennis provided names. He provided timelines. He provided financial routing details. Everything Catherine had suspected was now anchored to testimony. As the interview concluded, Dennis asked one final favor. "Tell his family I'm sorry," he said. Dennis Yule died 3 days later. Catherine submitted her report immediately. This time, it could not be ignored. The combination of witness testimony, financial records, vehicle documentation, and a direct confession forced the federal government to confront a reality it had avoided for more than 30 years. Robert Harmon had not defected. He had been abducted, and his disappearance had been engineered to look like treason. As Catherine finalized the closing section of Part 2, she noted the significance of what had just occurred. For the first time since 1987, the case was no longer theoretical. It had a perpetrator. It had a motive, and it had a trail that led somewhere specific. But there was one thing Dennis had not provided: justice. That would require arrests, trials, public reckoning, and consequences for those who had benefited from Robert Harmon's silence. As Catherine prepared the transition memo, she wrote one final line, not for the file, but for history. The truth had been buried for 33 years, but it was no longer buried. Someone had been paid to make Robert Harmon disappear. The witness was ignored, the evidence buried, the lie protected. Now the confession was real, and the reckoning was about to begin. What Dennis Yule revealed was only the beginning. In the next part, we follow what happened after the confession, the arrests, the trial, and the truth finally brought into the open. Part 3 completes this story. And if you haven't watched Part 1, where Robert Harmon disappeared and the defection lie was born, you'll find the link in the description below. This story begins there. Watch Part 1, The Disappearance, Part 3, The Reckoning, coming next.